Good afternoon and welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting for Saturday, April 2nd. Today is really a pre-conference discussion for a conference that will be held next Saturday here, starting at 9 a.m. by the Schiller Institute, by the Schiller Institute, which is called Conference to Convoke an International Conference to Establish a New Security and Development Architecture for All Nations. Now, this is a process that Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the president and founder of the Schiller Institute, has been involved in for quite some time. And we are going to be devoting today's discussion, which will be with Harley, Schlanger, and with Dennis Small, whom I'll introduce when we come back. But before we do that, we have something special. 40 years ago, on April 2nd, 1982, there was the Malvinas War, sometimes called the Falkland War, between Great Britain, Falkland Islands War, between Great Britain and Argentina. On the occasion of that 10 years ago, Lyndon LaRouche made a special message which sort of just surfaced 10 years to this day. And what we're going to do is show you that message because of the way in which its core ideas eerily echo the present moment.
My respects to the President of Argentina, Cristina Fernandez, on this occasion. My greetings to the people of Argentina. Argentina and I have shared during the past 30 years or so, we've shared many experiences together, memorable, happy generally, and we hope for the future the same. We're now faced with, as a planet, and a people of the planet, with the greatest threat to mankind which probably has ever existed. We are hovering at present, since the murder of the former president of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. We've been hovering ever since then on the verge of going into new wars into Libya and into Iran. And the intent of those new wars was to trigger a larger war, which would become the launching of a thermonuclear war, featuring the assigned role of the United States under President Obama to launch a general thermonuclear war on Russia, China, and other nations. Such a war, as those of you in the know, shall we say, would understand that Russia would respond with thermonuclear response on the first instance of the evidence of such an assault upon it and China similarly, and other nations probably similarly. This would mean the launching of a thermonuclear war of a type which calls into question the ability of the human species to continue to exist under the kinds of conditions such warfare would create. At present, I'm proud to say that leading military figures of the United States and other relevant figures have done their best to postpone this war and to prevent it if possible. But we cannot hold out forever. As long as this president, with his current intention, President Obama, continues in office, the threat of that warfare continues. If that president were to leave office, I believe at that point we could say that the United States would no longer consent to participate in launching such warfare. On this particular occasion, therefore, we, peoples of various nations, must consider, first of all, preventing the launching of such a war. Because the launching of such a war would probably mean the threatened extinction of the human species. But nonetheless, there are certain people in the world who would rather see the species go extinct that they're losing the power to control it. Inevitably, as I said, the launching of such a war, even the threat of such a war, creates the danger of an extinction of the human species. Therefore, it is the duty of all nations to consider the means by which to prevent this war, and furthermore to examine the conditions which allowed such a threat to come into being. And that should be the concern of all responsible nations at this time. We should understand, however, in that connection, that there are certain conditions which allowed nations such as the United States and Britain to consider provoking such a war. It means that the conditions of life and the conditions of policy making on this nation, this planet, have been deficient. And the problem lies in the fact, as we know, that whereas we've had a population of this planet of estimated at 7 billion persons, the intent of the British monarchy, expressed intent repeatedly, is to reduce the world's population from a present level of approximately 7 billion persons to 1 or less. And it is this motive, expressed in that way, in terms of population control and population reduction, which engenders the hatred against mankind as a species, which allows such policies as those we have considered to be launched on this planet. And therefore we must re-examine the morality of the planet and the obligation, first of all, to preserve human life, to promote it, to improve the conditions of life, to increase the productive powers of labor of mankind, to elevate man in the universe. For example, one case, the great danger to the planet, which is obvious today, is that some large rock, probably launched from the vicinity of the Mars orbit or someplace like that, might be cleverly aimed at hitting the northern part of planet Earth. And it might be a very large rock whose impact would cause the extinction of the human species. I think that that possibility, and it is a possibility, even a probability, that unless we act now in the domain of space activities to take the actions which can divert such threats to life on Earth, that life on Earth might just disappear all by itself. And therefore we now have the responsibility to develop the possibility that mankind and its nations can cooperate to advance the capabilities of humanity in such a fashion that we can indeed master the occupation and development of Mars and other such objectives, knowing that these objectives ensure the dignity and meaning of life for the peoples of all nations on Earth. And I think that only that kind of determination, considering the fact that some nations and some leaders of nations are prepared to launch the virtual extinction of mankind through thermonuclear warfare, the time has come that some changes in outlook must be enforced. We must, of course, prevent this war from being launched by all means. But we must at the same time recognize we cannot continue to defend mankind unless we have the attitude and the morality and the practice to ensure that mankind persists, exists, improves, and rises to higher objectives within the solar system and beyond. Thank you.
Now that condition, just outlined by Lyndon LaRouche 10 years ago to the day, is the present condition that the planet seems to have suddenly found itself thrust into. But such a perception is false. The fundamental conditions addressed by LaRouche then are even more emphatically the conditions right now. There is now, however, also a growing resistance to Wall Street and the City of London's collapsed unipolar world order of the period of 1990 through 2020, a form of world order that was echoed by the British assault on what they kept compulsively calling the Falkland Islands, or the Malvinas Islands of Argentina, a decade earlier in 1982. People today are refusing to fall for the lie that Russia and China are to blame for the predestined collapse of the debt-ridden international zombie dollar system and the puppet governments that are protecting it. But humanity has to reverse in time the present fruitless drive toward oblivion by the self-destroyed transatlantic neoliberal elite. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, recently warned, quote, "We need a new security architecture, and I have proposed it to be in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia, which ended the 150 years of religious war in Europe. And the situation today, in the face of the danger of nuclear war, is much more dangerous even than then." Now, this week, there was a release of a policy document, the LaRouche Plan for a New International Architecture, and it will be featured at the upcoming conference in exactly 1 week, which will start at 9 a.m. in the morning, Convoke, an international conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. So that's the topic of today's meeting, and what we're going to have is two persons. We have, and people have seen him here often, TLO spokesman Harley Schlanger, as well as Dennis Small, Ibero-American editor of Executive Intelligence Review, and the project coordinator for the 2020 policy paper, the LaRouche Program for the Planet, 1.5 billion new productive jobs. So we're going to start off with Harley first and then come to Dennis. So Harley.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and hello to everyone. I had a discussion with Helga Zepp-LaRouche today as our weekly webcast dialogue, and she made an emphatic point that there's a realignment going on in the world today. Now, this is not the realignment that was intended by the Anglo-American oligarchy operating under the direction of the City of London, Wall Street, and related higher authorities. The realignment they had intended was mapped out at a series of conferences at Davos, the Munich Security Conference, the International Monetary Fund Conference, the G7 summits, and the so-called Democracy Summit last summer, where they said that the world is divided between the democratic states and the authoritarian states, and the democracies must come together to win. Now, their intent in all of these meetings was to establish the conditions where there would be no resistance to their plans for the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, which would have plunged mankind back into an economic situation where it would have been impossible to sustain even half the population on the planet. And that was the genocidal Malthusian order that was intended in the deliberations of those conferences. A major part of that deliberation was aimed at the destruction of Russia and China as an opposition force, and in particular, how to degrade the Russian economy so that Putin could be ousted, while preparing a similar plan for China. In the first phase, a containment of those two countries, and then moving in for the kill. Now, since the Ukraine situation has developed and the Russians launched their special military operations, we're seeing the use of sanctions, which are explicitly stated by the people who drafted them as intending to destroy the Russian economy. And it was based on the idea that the unity of NATO and the European Union alliance would be strong enough to impose on the rest of the world support for these sanctions, and therefore it would succeed. As I'm going to develop in a moment, what the people who propose this are facing now is a backlash from key sectors of the governments of the world and the world population. and they're also about to be hit by a boomerang effect in Europe and the United States from the effect of the sanctions coming back to destroy the standards of living in those countries. Now, this present intent goes back to the Cold War, and it would be a mistake to say that it started in 1990, because many of the aspects of the institutional Russophobia were present from the very end of World War II, in particular the intent of people such as Winston Churchill, Bertrand Russell, and others, and the presence of operatives such as Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Madeleine Albright, and others working from this British approach to maintain the United States as the ally for the intent to maintain an empire and to defeat Russia. That's been there and continues to be there, and it's being drawn upon in the current situation. But I want to talk about what happened since 1990, when you had the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, December 91, and you had the emergence of the idea of a unipolar order, which was proclaimed by George Herbert Walker Bush on September 11th, 1991, when he announced the New World Order following the U.S. defeat of Iraq in Desert Storm. And of course, 2 months later, the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, this whole idea of the unipolar order was given a kind of theoretical structure with a completely harebrained theory that was the product of Francis Fukuyama called the end of history, which declared the triumph of neoliberalism, and therefore the responsibility of the United States and its allies to defeat any tendency which is opposed to that neoliberalism. And what was the center of that neoliberal policy? It was the British policy. It was the free market approach, the globalization approach under free trade conditions of IMF central bank dictatorship. And this was the intent behind the proclamation of the end of history. One of the targets of this was post-Soviet Russia. And this was seen with the policies after 1991 imposed by the United States and Europe on Russia, directed by bankers from Wall Street, from London, from academics from Columbia University, Harvard, and the University of Chicago, to carry out something called shock therapy, the purpose of which was supposedly to have a transition to a free market economy in Russia. And they recruited people from Russia who were called the Chicago Boys in Russia in 1991 to oversee this policy. The result was a deindustrialization of the Soviet economy, which, even though it had failed and was in a state of collapse, nevertheless had a certain industrial capability, a certain educated workforce, but this was the target. And the nation of Russia was picked apart by the Western bankers working together with some Russian insiders. It led to a demographic collapse. It also led to a further disintegration of Russia and an attempt to dismantle it in insurgencies in Chechnya, in Georgia, and elsewhere. Now, a major part of this offensive against Russia was the strategy of NATO enlargement. And this NATO enlargement went against the promises given to the Russians when Gorbachev met with the Western leaders and was told that if Russia accepted the peaceful return of East Germany through reunification with West Germany and the subsequent dismantling of the Warsaw Pact military alliance, that there would be no further eastward movement of NATO. The idea was that East Germany would not be used as a staging area for NATO, and the rest of the Warsaw Pact countries would not be brought into NATO. Now, this came to a head in a special meeting in 1994 in Budapest, where Yeltsin was clued into the fact that while Clinton was speaking about the Partnership for Peace, which included a possible promise of NATO membership for Russia. And the obvious question is, why do you need NATO if you no longer have a Soviet Union and a Warsaw Pact? But what Yeltsin discovered was that while Clinton was talking about the Partnership for Peace, his eager beavers in the State Department and Defense Department and elsewhere, and security services and intelligence services, were planning to incorporate the former Eastern European partners of the Warsaw Pact into NATO. And it led to something called the blow-up in Budapest, where there was a conference in 1994. Now, at that time, the United States was insisting that Russia calmly accept the wonderful offers of economic help and reintegration into the West. But actually, the Russians saw that what was going on was this expansion of NATO. And Yeltsin had a blow-up with Clinton. And it led to a memo that was written by William Burns, who's today the CIA director. If we can put that on the screen, please. Burns at the time was a director for Russian policy at the National Security Council. And what he wrote in a memo has very powerful relevance for today. He said, the U.S. had to separate our understandable anger on the tone of the debate, that is Yeltsin's response to Clinton, with Russia's substantive concerns, which we must take seriously. And what were the substantive concerns? The concern over the expansion of NATO toward the borders of Russia. Now, interestingly, the same William Burns wrote a similar memo in 2008. If I could have the second slide, please, Jose. This was a memo that was written at a time when, again, there was discussion of expansion of NATO, this time bringing in Ukraine and Georgia, as they had, quote, aspirations, unquote, for membership in NATO. And Burns, at that time, wrote a memo which he titled, Niet means Niet. In other words, no means no. And he said, Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. And he went on to write about the possibility of civil war in Ukraine and the splitting of the country. So it was clear, going back to 94, reiterated in 2008, that at least some senior U.S. officials understood that the Ukraine issue was one of an existential concern for Russia. Now, Putin raised this at 2007 in his speech to the Munich Security Conference. And from 2007 to the present, he has repeatedly warned of the danger of bringing Ukraine into NATO, of arming the country, including the fact that the country has a nationalist component of unreconstructed Nazis who trace their lineage back to the Galician SS units that deployed under Stefan Bandera and other Nazis when the Germans had conquered Ukraine on their march toward the Soviet Union. Now, this was a continuous concern, and Putin brought this forward in his December meeting with Biden, when he insisted on legally binding written security agreements that would be security guarantees for Russia. Now, what happened between 2008 and the present? Well, there was a coup in 2014, the so-called Maidan Revolution, which was a coup run largely by U.S. intelligence networks, neoconservatives such as Victoria Nuland, who was in the State Department in the Europe section at that time, but also incorporated the George Soros networks, conservative networks in the Republican Institute of the Congress and the National Endowment for Democracy, and other NGOs, which LaRouche always said NGO stands for no good organization. But these were all involved in the coup in Ukraine, which led to a confrontation between the nationalists, so-called, in Kiev and the ethnic Russians in the Donbass region. So this was a powder keg, and it exploded in a 2014-2015 war, which continues to the present as Ukrainian forces are shelling and killing mostly civilians in the eastern part of Ukraine in the Donbas region. But something else happened in 2017. Between the time that George Herbert Walker Bush announced the New World Order and 2017, especially after 9/11, the U.S. strategic policy was shaped by the global war on terror. And the idea was that the United States asserted its right as the unipolar power to determine which nations were threats, which nations could be targeted with preemptive warfare. And this happened with Afghanistan. Afghanistan had very little to do with the 9/11 attacks on the United States, certainly not the country of Afghanistan, but it became a target for regime change. Similarly, Iraq. In 2011, Libya. In 2014, Ukraine. And in that same period of time as Libya, Syria became targeted for regime change. The idea was that these would be preventive wars to get rid of bad actors who allegedly were connected with terrorism. And of course, the fact that there was never any evidence that Saddam had anything to do with 9/11 or that Assad had anything to do with 9/11. In fact, the two of them were opponents of the networks that were involved, the Saudi-run networks that were allowed with the connivance on some level of U.S. intelligence to take down the targets in the United States. That was never allowed to come to the surface. And instead, these other countries were targeted in a bogus war on terror. And that became the strategic focus of the United States. Well, in 2017, there was a new document written, a national security strategy paper that was largely done under the direction of the three generals that were running an element of Trump's foreign policy. That is, while he was saying that the United States must become friends with Putin, and in 2017 also with Xi Jinping, that we could have cooperation and agreement on key issues and even friendship, you had the old Russophobes, including Mattis, McMaster, and John Kelly, who were running Trump's foreign policy, who were behind the drafting of a new strategy document, which said that it's time to move beyond the war on terror, that this was an example of strategic complacency toward the real threat, which is the great powers, the so-called revisionist powers, who represented a great power challenge to the United States. This included, in this document, a discussion of upgrading the U.S. nuclear capability, which had supposedly eroded during that time, and required being prepared for nuclear war, but also the use of nuclear weapons against other countries in conventional warfare. This was reflected recently in Jake Sullivan's statement about a nuclear contingency which the United States must maintain. Now, after this security strategy was put forward, there was, I reported last week, a RAND Corporation document in 2019, which specifically talked about how to bring down Russia. And the first point that they presented was use Ukraine. Now, this then became a central strategy because of one particular problem with the intention of this globalist elite, which is that Russia and China, as sovereign nation states, were not willing to submit to the strategy of the Great Reset, which would have put all control globally of banking and finance in the hands of primarily Western central bankers and whatever puppets they could impose in these other countries. And secondly, the Green New Deal, the anti-science, anti-technology policy, which is a cover using global warming as an issue for reducing the world's population. Neither Russia nor China would submit to that. So a funny thing happened on the way to the Great Reset. with the rejection of Russia and China, it became increasingly clear that many other nations would be looking to them as leaders in this fight, and possibly toward a change in the global financial system to take power away from institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And so what we saw with the Russian, in particular, Russia's refusal, the heating up of Ukraine once again. Now, as this heating up of Ukraine took place, it became clear to Putin that the West would not consider his legitimate security guarantees. And in a sense, he was compelled to move into Ukraine to protect Russia, to protect Russian ethnic populations in the East, and to eliminate the danger that would be implicit, or explicit, I should say, if Ukraine were brought in as a member of NATO. But at the same time, the consolidation of a Russian-Chinese alliance was undergoing consolidation, which was highlighted by the February 4th meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping, in which they made an agreement, a number of agreements on military, but primarily economic cooperation. Now, this became a major sticking point in the Anglo-American strategy, because they had hoped to pit Russia against China, the old Nixon-Kissingerian strategy, to break the two and to tell the Russians you can't trust the Chinese and tell the Chinese you can't trust the Russians. But this alliance has been intensified by the US and NATO attack on Russia. And by attack on Russia, I mean the economic warfare and the cynical use of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people as a battering ram against Russia. No one really likes war. Well, some people do, but most human beings don't like war and the horror that we see that takes place during war. But remember, the people who are now pointing fingers at Russia did much more damage when they leveled the city of Fallujah in Iraq, when they targeted civilian populations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. And as military commentators have pointed out, more Iraqis were killed in the first 5 minutes of the shock and awe policy in Iraq than in the 4 weeks of the special operations going on in Ukraine. Now, the other problem they have is they're not getting full support. We see countries that are being bullied to support NATO, to support the sanctions against Russia. These countries include many of the countries that were part of the non-aligned movement, or that have a tradition of anti-colonialism. They've seen this before. They've faced the British Empire and the European colonialists. And so there's a great deal of sympathy in many parts of the world for Russia having to confront this Anglo-American attempt to destroy Russia and the Putin presidency. Now, further, because of the economic warfare against Russia, it's clear there's no security in the dollar system. And so by pushing countries to join them against Russia, they're creating an incentive for countries to instead look to what Russia and China might do. Not only is there no security in the dollar system, you have inflation, you have the energy problems. On top of that, you have the decision to literally steal money from Venezuela, from Iran, especially recently from Afghanistan, and now from Russia, the confiscation of $300 billion of Russian dollar reserves. So why would any country look to the United States and NATO countries for economic security? So the question is there an alternative? Now, we're seeing this somewhat in slow motion, but it's there. The rubles for gas policy, for example. Putin said that any unfriendly country that wants to continue to get Russian oil and gas has to pay in rubles. Now, the EU and the United States are saying no. Well, what will it mean in Germany, for example, if Russian oil and gas is cut? And officials from major corporations, BASF and Siemens, pointed out the German industry would come to a standstill. There are talks about possible rationing of gasoline for automobiles and trucks, heating, electricity for industry will be cut off. So the policy toward Russia is now going to be one of wartime austerity in Western countries, including in the United States. So we see the rubles for gas representing something interesting. Instead of money created by computer with nothing backing it up, which is what the quantitative easing policy has been. And by the way, there's just a report from the Fed that said after a $13 trillion infusion of funny money in the fourth quarter of 2019, there was more than 20 trillion more put into the system. I think the figure is actually 27 trillion in the first quarter of 2020. You want to know why there's inflation? It's not Putin. It's not even the oil companies. It's the quantitative easing policy of the same central banks that are demanding control over spending policy with the Great Reset. So you see Putin saying, no, we're going a different way. We're going to put something physical behind currency, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's lumber, whether it's strategic metals, whether it's wheat, fertilizer. Russia has a lot to offer or gold to back its currency, while the Western fiat system has nothing backing it up. So the Saudis are now talking to the Chinese about taking yuan for oil. We're seeing a rupee-ruble agreement in India. So what's the reaction of the would-be masters of the universe in the Anglo-American crowd? Well, I'll call your attention to two developments just over the last days. First is an attack on the nation of Pakistan, whose Prime Minister Imran Khan has played a major role in saying that Pakistan will not support the sanctions against Russia because Pakistan does not wish to be pulled into a bloc, either a Western bloc or a Russian bloc, but wishes to be a mediator. In fact, Khan offered to be a mediator between the US and China. What was the response to that? A no confidence vote was brought up in the Pakistani parliament, which will be voted on tomorrow. A Pakistan ambassador said that he was told that an American official said that Pakistan would have better relations with the United States without Khan as the prime minister. Now, for those who have an institutional memory, you might remember the case of Ali Bhutto, the prime minister of Pakistan in the late 70s, who undertook the development in Pakistan of a nuclear program for nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. And Henry Kissinger said that if he continued with this, we will make a horrible example of you. And shortly after that, Bhutto was overthrown in a coup and eventually hanged. And later on, his daughter was assassinated when she rose to the Pakistani prime minister position. So the Pakistanis understand this, and hopefully they'll incorporate this in the pressure on the parliament to reject the no confidence vote tomorrow. The second case is India. Sergei Lavrov has been in India the last couple of days talking about the consolidation of the ruble-rupee agreement, as well as Russian oil and gas and weapon systems to India. The U.S. sent an official named Dalip Singh, who's one of the key architects of the sanction policy against Russia. He was sent to India. And he, in a press conference after his meeting, said, well, we had a friendly conversation. And they asked, what did you tell them? We told them not to make deals for oil and gas from Russia and not to help Russia avoid the sanctions. But the friendly discussion included him saying that there would be consequences for India if they didn't go along with the US and NATO on this. Again, there's the case in India of a friend of Lyndon and Helga Zepp-LaRouche named Indira Gandhi, who was part of the tradition of the non-aligned movement, who didn't go along with the British and American policy, who was the target of assassination, as well as her son. So in these countries, there's a very clear understanding of what it means to go against the consensus of NATO, of London and Washington. But there's a new game in town. There's a potential for a realignment. That's what we'll be taking up at our conference next Saturday. And that's what we have done in preparing a paper for what an alternative economic policy would be, an alternative economic and financial architecture to the zero growth Malthusian killer policy, which is represented by the forces of the present governments of the United States, the United Kingdom, and going along with them, the European Union.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Harley. And if you've just joined us, we want to make sure that you know that you're now participating in a pre-conference discussion of what we call the LaRouche Plan, Economic Development, Not Thermonuclear War. There's a conference that will be happening next week starting at 9 a.m., an international conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. We're next going to hear from Dennis Small, the Ibero-American editor of Executive Intelligence Review and project coordinator for the 2020 policy paper, the LaRouche Program for the Planet 1.5 New Productive Jobs. And Dennis has been working on the new version, not even new version of that plan, is sort of an advanced version for a new international economic architecture. So, Dennis, happy to see you, and let's go.
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. And the I guess it's worth starting by recalling for people the old adage. I'm sure you've all heard it. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. There is another adage which is much less well known and less referred to, and that goes like this: if it is broke, you ought to fix it. Now, the reason that people prefer to recall the first and not the second is, it allows them to remain sitting on their couch watching the football game or the latest in the March Madness and so on, while their house collapses around them, and they say, nah, it's not really broke. If it were broke, I'd fix it, but it's not broke. The world financial and economic and security system is so broke that if we don't fix it, we are going to be disappearing as a species, and that is not an overstatement. How bad is it broke? Well, let's just take a look at some of the immediate scenario around the sanctions, and that's only the latest piece in this puzzle here. On the food front, in 2022, we are looking at a situation where, according to leading experts and economists, the expected level of starvation of individuals for this year will not be 230 million people, which is what it was prior to this immediate situation, but they're now talking about as many as 1 billion people dying of starvation as a result of the lack of food and what little food that there is being out of reach because of the prices of it. Take the situation of wheat. 1/3 of all of the wheat that's traded on the world exchanges is produced by Russia and Ukraine. That's no longer getting out and going anywhere. And that 1/3 is an average. There are parts of the world, like the Middle East and North Africa, known as the MENA region, where countries are 70% dependent on these food imports. They're not getting them. What do? We were recently talking with a friend from Panama who said, well, we've got a problem. We can't import wheat anymore. So we're trying to figure out how in the world we can grow, not wheat, because you can't grow wheat in Panama, but yucca, far less nutritious than wheat for sure. You have an extraordinary systemic breakdown going on. That's just one small example. The situation with fertilizer, NPK fertilizers, is, are rather important to produce food. 25% of all of the fertilizers that are used in Europe come from Russia. I guess I should change my verb tense. Came from Russia, because that's now all prohibited. What impact is that going to have? It's going to be enormous. You have a situation where, as I said, the price of food is soaring. And this was happening way before the sanctions, way before the war. This comes off the huge hyperinflationary explosion of financial aggregates, which has been transferred into the prices of commodities and consumer goods and so on. The World Price Index for food, as developed by World Bank and food and agricultural bodies, rose by 54% over the last 18 months, most of that in the most recent period. You've probably seen that at your own supermarket, but this is a world pattern. Now, take energy. Food's a little bit necessary. Energy is also a little bit necessary. The situation for Europe, I mean, parenthetically, the food situation is going to hit, in particular, the nations of the South. It's hitting everybody, but those countries, that's where you're going to get those 1 billion people starving to death if we don't turn this around. The energy situation is, of course, going to hit there and hit the United States, is already hitting the United States, but it's going to have a particular impact on Europe. Now, Europe is extremely dependent on energy imports coming from Russia. In the case of Germany in particular, as you can see in the first graph, which I want to show you on the screen here, of Germany's total energy consumption in the year 2020, which was 12,410 petajoules, that's the unit that's used to measure that. About 56% of all of the energy that they used was imported. 44% came from domestic sources. But of those imports, of all the gas they imported, 13% of the total consumption came from Russia. In oil, 11%. You pull that out of the German energy consumption matrix, and what you've got is 24% less energy in that country. Now, that's not belt tightening. That's not a small reduction. That means the bottom falling out of the economy instantly. And although there are some reserves that they still have, so this isn't going to happen day after tomorrow, process is what's now underway, which is one of the reasons you have such panic going on in Germany. Germany was more than arm twisted into going along with the British and the United States on the sanctions policy on Russia after they had at first resisted it, but they're absolutely terrified of what this means. So yeah, they were forced to sign on the bottom line on the sanctions, but believe me, their hand was shaking when they signed, saying, yes, we agree with this policy. They're going to lose 24% of their energy. What does that mean? And again, that's just the situation of Germany. If you take the situation in Hungary, you're talking about a situation where 85% of their gas is imported from Russia and 64% of their oil. What are they supposed to do? The Hungarians are not going along with this policy because they don't feel like starving to death and freezing to death because of the policy of maintaining a dying, collapsing world financial system, which is behind the sanctions policy. Now, the price situation in terms of energy is equivalent to what we're seeing on food. The actual physical amounts are collapsing, and what little is available cannot be purchased. The price of oil, West Texas Intermediate oil, rose in the last 3 months from mid-December to mid-March, rose from $68 per barrel to $112 per barrel. That is a 65% increase in 3 months. The situation of natural gas in Europe rose from $2,130 per cubic meter to $4,000 per cubic meter in that same 3-month period. That's an 85% increase. So you're talking about not a decline, not a recession, not even a depression. This is a bottom falling out of the system, intentionally induced situation, which is occurring at this point. That's what we're looking at right now. The sanctions, this policy is not only hitting such vital things as food and energy, even more vital things such as science is also being destroyed by this policy. There is no Mars mission left. There's not a possibility of having a Mars mission without Russia. There's not going to be an International Space Station. none of the necessary scientific work in space of the sort that Lyndon LaRouche was describing 10 years ago, of a strategic defense of the Earth, joint cooperative effort to protect the planet and the species from asteroids, comets, and so on. All of that is being sacrificed. And of course, as you can see in the next graph, or map, which is that of the Belt and Road Initiative, viewers are undoubtedly very familiar with this. This is what has developed over the recent period of China working with Russia and with the nations of Europe to develop a growing, very significant rail corridor linking East and West, vastly increasing the productivity of all of the economies at each end and along the way of this thing. It turns out that of all of the rail traffic cargo going on these rails, about 80 to 90% takes the northern route. In other words, the one that goes from China into Russia. You see both the northern one going through Mongolia, but also the principal one that goes through Kazakhstan and then into Russia, and then from there west to Moscow, and then from there into the rest of Europe. That's off. That's not happening. Although it is not yet the case that oil and so on is prohibited as part of the sanctions on this thing. No one is willing to ship along these lines at this point because there's no insurance to be had, and no one knows if you're ever going to be able to get your goods at the other end. So this is another major area of collapse. Now, this is really only an immediate snapshot of the problem, but it doesn't really tell us what the causality of it is. Because these sanction policies, as Harley was indicating in his bird's eye view of 20, 30 years of history, has a corresponding development in terms of the economy. And what's going on is that since 1971 in particular, as Lyndon LaRouche uniquely and solely forecast, that was the beginning of the end. It was the beginning of the systemic breakdown of the transatlantic financial system, which would be playing out over coming decades if we didn't change our policy. And that is in fact what has been playing out. Many of you will be familiar with this next graphic, which is LaRouche's famous triple curve function, or the typical collapse function, which schematically shows on the upper part the green curve of rising monetary aggregates. This is the rate of growth, not the absolute amount. Rate of growth of monetary aggregates. Financial aggregates, which is not just the monetary aggregates, but it's all the whole derivatives bubble on top of that, of the simple issuance of money, and so on, growing at a more rapid rate up to the point where you have to have rates of growth of monetary aggregates which are greater than the rates of growth of the financial aggregates to even try to keep them intact. And then, of course, indicated by the collapsing arrow, 2008, the crash that occurred, and so on. Now, the key part of this graph, however, is the bottom curve, the blue curve, the light blue curve, which LaRouche called the physical economic input-output. In other words, the real physical economy. And this is the rate of growth, which is negative throughout this period, both for the United States and for the world economy, or the transatlantic sector as a whole, where the actual, not GDP, because that's dollar measurement of things that have no productive value whatsoever, like drugs, which are now being legalized in the Congress of the United States. I guess they wanted to authorize their own de facto use of the same, so they figured they would pass a law to forgive themselves. They copped a plea with themselves on this thing and just voted in favor of legalizing so-called recreational marijuana. In any event, that's not real value. The physical economic parameters required for actual growth are indicated in the bottom blue curve. Now, this has been collapsing since 1971. Now, let's just take a little bit of a close-up in the next graph of that bottom curve alone. Okay, this is the picture of that bottom curve as part of this overall graphic, collapsing since 1971. But that's not all that happened. As this was going on, as you can see in the next graphic, something else happened. a couple of things happened. In March of 2020, forgive the scale, it's not drawn to scale, this is drawn so you can see it. What happened with the worldwide COVID pandemic is that it uncovered a pre-existing 46% global real unemployment rate. And as part of the completely inadequate, incompetent, and unscientific approach adopted in most of the Western countries, emphatically including the United States, we had a ratchet down of this curve. This is not just a straightforward ongoing decline. There was a rapid ratchet down. It did not happen in China. China responded and still is responding in the proper fashion with the zero COVID policy. What we did here was a complete blunder and continues to be a blunder in terms of the approach on this thing. So that was one ratchet down, but that wasn't all, because then, just about a year and change afterwards, a year and a half afterwards, was that famous COP26 meeting, which Harley also referred to, where the intentional Malthusian policy of destroying the world's physical economy was pushed forward by the British monarchy through Prince Charles and others, trying to induce the entire world to accept, more than tightening their belt, destroying their own economies. And there was a significant amount of resistance to that, in fact, to the point where even the COP organizers declared that COP had been a flop. But what was most interesting there is what Prince Charles said about this, about how you had to deal with this, which is the following. He said, climate change and biodiversity loss pose an even greater existential threat than the COVID-19 pandemic, to the extent that we have to put ourselves on a warlike footing. A warlike footing. And yes, that's exactly what they did, using the expansion of NATO and the Ukraine process to then unleash this scorched earth policy called sanctions. It had been started much earlier, but especially what happens in the beginning of this year, February 2022, which is another dramatic ratchet down in the physical economy, which has been induced on this thing. Now, I want you to just take a look at the year 1971, because there's a reason that that's there. Once you have that in mind, we don't need to see this graph anymore, but keep in mind 1971. Why did LaRouche say that 1971 was the turning point? And by the way, he first announced that 71 was the turning point in 1971. In other words, when it happened, he called it. And he said, this is the beginning of the end of the Western transatlantic system, with Nixon's announcement of August 1971. Now, this is mostly associated with Nixon's announcement with regard to the dollar and gold, taking the dollar off the gold reserve system. And that's relevant, but that's not the thing that happened. That was simply the mechanism whereby what was induced was a dramatic shift from the fixed exchange rate system, where you had fixed parities, exchange rates among the currencies of the world, so that you could then guarantee that you knew what the cost would be of imports and exports, you could invest over the long term and so on, which is the necessary framework. And instead what was introduced was the floating rate system. And under the floating rate system and the free convertibility of all currencies, what began was a wild speculative binge, where the carry trade and the speculation on these floating exchange rates began to become the actual center of the world financial system. And it was that switch from a fixed exchange rate system to a floating exchange rate system, which is the absolutely decisive thing that happened in 1971. Because what happened there, that was actually the beginning of the end of the Glass-Steagall system. Glass-Steagall was wiped out in the United States in 1999, but 1971 was the end of the equivalent of Glass-Steagall worldwide. Because in a country that doesn't have the dollar as its currency, you protect your own national currency from a speculative cancerous infection called this London-based dollar through a fixed rate system with exchange controls. You simply say, no, you cannot allow one speculative system to infect the other productive system. And that ended in 1971. That's the end of Glass-Steagall on a world scale. Inside the United States, the Glass-Steagall system does the exact same thing that a fixed exchange rate with exchange control system does internationally. We had a setup, thank you to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where from 1903, we had the equivalent of that strict division between speculative investment and productive investment, and therefore our banking system was able to function. So that's really what the meaning is of 1971. I mean, incidentally, what's happened since then is derivatives based on exchange rate fluctuations today, as of the end of June 2021, I looked up the statistics this morning on the Bank for International Settlements website, which has the official statistics on derivatives. As of that date, the latest date, there was a total of $102 trillion in derivatives on exchange rate speculation. Now, there's more on interest rate speculation, but that's small comfort. It's all part of the same thing in any event. Now, under these circumstances, since what we are actually seeing around the excuse of the Ukraine war and the sanctions that have been imposed is the systemic breakdown of a system, what we are required to do, excuse me, is recall what Linda LaRouche always said, which is when the crisis hits, people are going to need to turn rapidly to the solutions which LaRouche provided. And we've been organizing for this for 50 years, usually without getting much credit or praise for it, on some occasions getting breakthroughs, but with the idea that when push came to shove, and that has now happened, people around the world were going to start to say, what do we do? And the document that we have just issued, which is called the LaRouche Plan for a New International Economic Architecture, is actually meant as a discussion document, not only for this upcoming conference on next weekend on April 9th, but it's also meant as a discussion document for every government around the world, every political party, every leading politician who really wants to think, and every statesman around the world who now knows they need to turn to LaRouche's ideas on this thing. And our document is meant to simply whet people's appetites and open their thinking so that they go and study LaRouche. That's what they need to do at this point. Now, what this document goes through, it begins by looking at the actual physical economic parameters available in an alliance of three countries that LaRouche always talked about, which was Russia, India, and China. He also always talked to them, incidentally. But if you look at those three countries, we began by looking at the physical economic parameters, what they have available. Let me say that again. We began by looking at the physical production capabilities in that area. We did not begin by looking at gold. We did not begin by looking at exchange rate or prices or anything like that. What's the actual potential? And just to quickly summarize some of this, if you look at the next graphic on the screen, you will see that if you take those three countries together, as you can see in the upper left-hand graphic, they represent 38% of the world's population of 7.8 billion people. The red sliver is Russia, the light pink is China, and the darker pink is India. And blue or purple is the rest of the world. So this grouping of nations who have had it with the current rigged world speculative system and are trying to build an alternative, even though there are differences among them, they represent 38% of the world's population. They also represent 42% of the world's wheat production. As you can see on the upper right-hand side, they represent 23% of the world's natural gas production. They represent 66% of the world's steel production. Now, of course, you have to look at not just physical objects produced, you have to look at science and technology as well, which is absolutely critical. If you look at nuclear energy, although they represent 23% of all nuclear energy generation on the planet. If you look at new nuclear generation capacity being built now, those three countries represent 45% of the world total. So there are many things that these group of nations are missing in terms of physical economy. They need to develop. They have relative deficiencies in terms of capital goods, in terms of certain advanced areas of technology, in terms of aircraft production, machine tools, and so on and so forth. But that's one of the great strengths that they do have. Now, the second thing that we did, and you look at that as a starting point, as a potential capability on this, the question becomes, okay, what kind of an international system do you need? And what you have to do is you have to return instantly, immediately, by decision of those and allied nations to a fixed rate exchange rate system. In other words, you have to distance yourself completely from the speculative dollar. You have to implement Glass-Steagall internationally in just that fashion. You have to establish fixed exchange rates among the nations participating in this thing. It would probably be helpful if you back those currencies where possible with gold, but the stability does not come from the gold. The stability does not come from the oil or the gas. The stability of a currency comes from the channeling of credit into productive high technology investment. That's a lesson learned from Alexander Hamilton. So you have to have a fixed exchange rate system internationally. You completely isolate yourself from the floating exchange rate system. You put an end to the idea of the carry trade of speculation, and you establish a regional common currency, which will increasingly become the basis on which you carry out international trade and investment, productive investment, in such things as the Belt and Road Initiative, as is now going on. Third, after starting with the physical economy, proceeding to the international required system to allow each nation to function, you then establish in participating nations full set capital and exchange controls. In other words, you do not allow the free convertibility of your currency into the dollar, because that is the mechanism that these countries have been destroyed by. It's, like the City of London and Wall Street is like Dracula knocking at the door of these economies and says, "Oh, won't you please open your door? I'd like to donate blood." And when these countries open their door to Dracula, the international financial system, blood is not donated. Blood is sucked out of their economy, and they're destroyed by financial looting. So it's very simple. As with Glass-Steagall, you slam the door in Dracula's nose, and that's life. That's the way it goes. Now, the reason to have a fully protected national currency in this way is so that you can establish a banking system which is protected from speculation and which channels credit, exactly as Hamilton indicated, into areas of infrastructure and productive investment of all sorts. This is what Russia is now beginning to do around their war economy, which they've established out of necessity. But it's the sort of thing that which becomes possible, especially if you're working along with other countries and other nations. And this is then the fourth point, is you have to use the RIC, the Russia, India, China Cooperative Group, to expand immediately, especially to those nations of the South that want to participate in a system which is not a blood-sucking system, the Dracula world, City of London system, but is actually based, like the Belt and Road Initiative is, on infrastructure projects, joint cooperation on science, and productive investment. And you will find, as you are now finding implicitly and cautiously, as Harley was discussing, the political developments, countries that are increasingly turning towards that grouping and saying survival is there. It is not with this policy of going down with the Titanic. And so this idea of the development of third world nations, especially Africa, using capital goods exports to those nations to help develop them and develop the inner core of this new system, is what will increase the overall productivity and give ultimately backing to this new currency. Now, you can't stop there. If you stop there, we're going to have thermonuclear war. Because if we allow the United States and Europe to continue being led around by the nose by a brass ring by the British, as we have been for many, many years, and continue on this policy of war and of speculation, if the world is decoupled into two groups this way, there will be war. That's exactly where we now stand. We have to provide the basis for recoupling these groups, these areas, but under a productive world system. We have to have a Treaty of Westphalia, which applies not only politically and internationally, but economically as well. And that's exactly why Lyndon LaRouche always talked about the four powers, that the United States must join Russia, India, China as the core of a productive world alliance for development. And it does not take a whole lot on the US side. All we have to do is go back to the basic fundamental constitutional principles on which this country was founded originally. It's Hamilton. That's exactly where this originated in the domain of economics. And so this must absolutely be done. And that's, of course, the purpose of the activities and the organizing of the Schiller Institute and the meaning of this conference. And in particular, we propose as a sixth point in this program, a program for the rapid development of Ukraine, of a neutral Ukraine, as a point of cooperation between East and West to save this country from the destruction which it's now being subjected to. And I don't mean simply the war. This started 30 years ago, starting with the liberal reforms in the situation of Ukraine between 1990 and 2012, before the 2014 Maidan revolution with the big support for the neo-Nazis. In that period, electricity production in Ukraine dropped 35%. Steel production fell 57%. Tractors dropped 94%. Ukraine was already being destroyed. It got worse under the period after Maidan, and now on top of that, just as with the global collapse of the physical economic curve, now you have the devastation wrought by the war. You're dealing with a situation where 35% of the population of Ukraine has been lost in a decade, 25% of its manufacturing labor force. You have a massive collapse of the potential relative population density of that country as part of the collapse of that metric of LaRouche's potential relative population density on a worldwide scale. And that's why it's both urgently necessary with Ukraine as with Afghanistan to use it as a proof of principle that in the worst of situations, where the conflict is greatest, where the destruction has been most severe, where perhaps the induced hatred is the highest, even there, an approach such as the Treaty of Westphalia and the economic concomitant of that, which is LaRouche's conception of physical economy, is in fact capable of turning the situation around. And that we must do, because the alternative is non-existent.
Okay, thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Harley. We have several questions. And again, if you've just joined us, we want to make sure you know you're now participating in a pre-conference discussion, preparation for a Schiller Institute conference next week, Convoke an international conference to establish a new security and development architecture for all nations. All right, so I want to go right to the questions since there's several of them. And I actually want to ask this one we'll ask first, which was from Jose, which is the immediate question I have refers to the Malvinas War. What was it? Why did it happen? When it did? And what is its relevance? For people who would have just tuned in, you may not have seen that we showed a video from Lyndon LaRouche from exactly April 2nd of 2012, exactly 10 years ago, which was done for the purposes of recognizing that occasion and had LaRouche speaking to the people of Argentina. So, Dennis?
Well, the Malvinas War, like many wars, if not all, under the direction of British geopolitics, are designed to produce a completely different effect than what they supposedly were claimed. The Malvinas War was induced. Argentina was tricked and duped deliberately by being misbriefed intentionally by Vernon Walters and other pro-British elements inside the U.S. establishment. They were told that if Argentina moved on the Malvinas, which historically were Argentine, there is no question that the Malvinas were Argentine, as Lyndon LaRouche said, at the point of the adoption of the Monroe Doctrine, which is governing law in the United States, written by John Quincy Adams, that was Argentine territory. So the Argentines, with a wink and a sly smile from Washington, said, "Oh, go ahead, we'll back you up." They moved, which was rightfully theirs, and then the British used the occasion and eventually managed to get the United States, Washington, to back them, despite LaRouche's opposition, to establish an entirely new policy. And we called it what it was at the time. Lyndon LaRouche was very explicit. He said the idea here is for a NATO out-of-area deployment into the southern Atlantic. Some people had talked about SATO, the South Atlantic Treaty Organization. They decided instead to use NATO for an out-of-area deployment. Why? To impose what we're now seeing, a unipolar world, to collect the debt and impose a top-down banker's dictatorship on every part of the world. And the Malvinas were meant as a bloody example, especially for the nations of Ibero-America, to never dare break with this system. Now, this was occurring at exactly the point that the debt bubble was blowing up, and Lyndon LaRouche was in the middle of discussions with Argentina, with López Portillo in Mexico, and others of what the proper response would be to that. And LaRouche's response during the Malvinas War, where he backed Argentina, he was the only American politician to do so based on the Monroe Doctrine. And he said, most significantly, gentlemen, if you want to win this war, yeah, fine, militarily, you got to do what you got to do. But look at the weak flank of the British enemy. Hit him on the weak flank. Use the debt bomb. Drop the debt bomb on the City of London and on Wall Street. And you will not only win this war, we will transform the entire international financial situation. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but Lyndon LaRouche's recommendations were absolutely spot on. So it's particularly relevant that today, April 2nd, the anniversary of the beginning of the Malvinas War 40 years ago, and 10 years ago to this day, LaRouche's video on that subject was about this issue of NATO expansion to areas where they have nothing to do other than defend the City of London speculative bubble. So it's exactly the same policy that we're seeing today, and that's why we thought that it would be most relevant to recall the occasion with that video of Lyndon LaRouche's.
Okay, Harley, I'm going to ask you if you have anything to say on that as well, but I'll do that by way of asking another question, which is from Adam, who says, surely we should build up a policy lobby of concerned citizens and politicians in Western countries to support the call for a new architecture of security and development. Now, that may not seem like it's a question, but I think it's a good thing for us to discuss at this point, since the entire program today is devoted to the upcoming conference. So if you have either something on what Dennis was saying or a particular response to Adam on this matter.
Well, I have nothing to add to what Dennis said about the Malvinas, although I remember distinctly we were in a meeting with Lyndon LaRouche when we first heard about this. And he immediately, as you remember, Dennis, came up with a strategy for addressing this that we moved on right away. And that was typical of the way LaRouche operated. Now, in terms of the question, look, what do we need to do with this conference? We have a problem with the U.S. Congress, which is that to the extent there are any people with any integrity there, they've been silenced by the groupthink of the Congress as a whole. And so it's almost impossible to imagine someone in the Congress showing the courage that someone like Tulsi Gabbard has shown in her repeated intervention against the NATO policy, or Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who has taken on the media line on what's going on in the war, or Scott Ritter. So what we have to do is inform people and inspire them with the program that Dennis just went through, that We don't have to accept the destruction of nations by this criminal cabal and accept it maybe unwillingly, but sit there and let it happen. And the most important thing is to make yourself an operative of the fight for the Peace of Westphalia. Now, that requires a little bit of work, understanding what the Peace of Westphalia was about. And we've written a lot on this, understanding the economic policies. Dennis went through some of it in his presentation. More of it's in the document that we've produced, but it's there for people. And then have the courage to go talk to everyone you know, especially when you hear people complaining. Give them a program, give them a sense of direction. And then we have to take this to every elected official. You know, the problem with so many people in the United States is you assume that because the elected officials all sound the same, they all have the same talking points, the anti-Russian, anti-China policy, you assume, and that's reinforced by the media, including Fox and including all of these so-called Democratic or liberal media, you assume that everyone's adhering to that. The fact is, fewer and fewer people are using the media. People are looking for alternative sources. We're seeing it in terms of people turning to us. So get your friends on our videos, get them to read our publications, engage in discussion, and then organize groups to go and confront your congressmen, confront your elected officials, run for Congress yourself. You know, 2022 is going to be an important election year. There's still a chance in a number of states to register to run for office and use the campaigns to bring up these points. But the most important thing is don't give in to the groupthink, which says there's nothing that can be done. We're on the verge of winning this fight. You know, the most powerful forces in the world, the US military and NATO, are incapable of intimidating countries like Pakistan and India and Indonesia and Brazil and Argentina to go along with them on the sanctions policy against Russia. More importantly, Russia and China and now India are showing themselves as allies for what would be a revival of the American system policy in the United States. So we have the majority on our side, but you have to organize people to understand that and to act on it. So I think the idea, whether you call it a citizens lobby, a committee of activation, or whatever you want to call it, join with us and bring others into this fight. This is what is the only way that will stop the United States from going into a self-destructive spiral.
Okay, the next question has got two parts. It's I'm going to give the first one to you, Dennis, and the second one to Harley. And this is from Wency. And he's asked this question. I wanted to know if the European countries that were requested to pay for the Russian gas and oil in rubles have managed to make their first payment, or if they did give a statement in response to President Putin's decree. He says, it's difficult now to follow up and stay up to date on the current affairs with all the censorship going on the internet. So that's the first question. The second question is, how can I learn about policy making to be able to work with, for example, African governments to introduce or to at least create policies that work for African countries? I hope I've managed to make my questions clear. So those are the two questions. And Dennis, if you could start us off.
Yeah, sure. The whole question of the gas price is a work in progress. And the Russians had made it clear from the very beginning. The statements from Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, was the deadline was April 1st, yesterday. But that didn't mean that they were going to turn the gas pipeline off at that point. The contracts have to be renegotiated. The Russians have made it very clear that they're going to be doing this by the book. They're not going to be providing any justification for lawsuits or anything of the sort. But this was a very relevant move on their part to break out of the game that was being played, to box them into a situation of either destroying themselves by just stopping the exports, not being paid for them with the assets being frozen, or to retaliate and say, okay, you know what, we're not going to send you guys any gas or oil, and see what happens there. That would have escalated the whole situation. And I think Putin, who's very good at this, smelled the trap. And as Lyndon LaRouche is fond of saying, or was fond of saying, was when you're given two choices, always select the third. And that's what Putin did in this case. So this has put the Europeans in a bind. And what I can tell you at this point is that there is no European unity on this. The Italians, the Germans, the French are still insisting that they're not going to pay. Hungary and Austria have just announced that they are. They're not going to stick to this. They can't. They can't conceivably not get Russian gas and oil in exchange. Replace it with what? There's nothing there to replace it with. Hungary said they're landlocked. They can't possibly get LNG terminals, ship the LNG gas in. It would cost 1 million times more, and so on. So this is an ongoing tug of war, which is happening around these policies. But it reflects a deeper debate and deeper discussion going on, especially inside Russia, because what this poses is the issue of payment for trade in non-dollar currencies. And what's most significant about this step is not only that they're strengthening the ruble by getting paid in rubles, it's not only that they're breaking the sanctions against them by forcing people to actually pay them in rubles, but most significantly, it's introducing or beginning to spread the idea that you can carry out trade without having to use the dollar, the speculative dollar, which, by the way, the dollar is not the US currency. Let's be clear. The dollar is the City of London's currency. We've had our currency stolen from us. This is no longer the national currency of the United States. It's a speculative, cancerous instrument. We need to break from that dollar as well to reestablish an actual greenback policy along the lines of Glass-Steagall and Hamilton. But so the steps are being taken in that direction. Saudi Arabia has said that they are the oil that they sell to China, they will take payments in renminbi. So that's very interesting. So the question is, how is this whole thing going to be coming together? Lavrov was just in India meeting with Prime Minister Modi, while, by the way, American representative and Britain's Liz Truss, the foreign minister, couldn't get a meeting with Modi. They were left on the telephone waiting for an answer. But Modi met with Lavrov, and one of the things under discussion is significantly increased shipments of Russian oil to India. India needs oil. They import a lot. They get very little from Russia. So they simply have to work out an arrangement of long-term fixed rate purchases with a ruble exchange. So these are all steps in the direction, but it all begs the issue of what LaRouche lays out most thoroughly, which is how do you establish a global system whose financial system is ultimately dependent not on financial jiggery-pokery and formulating this and that and the other and calculating this, that, and the other. It's based on a credit issuance policy to increase that bottom curve, the physical economic parameters, to increase the output and the productive output of society. That's the real issue that's on the table. And nobody has addressed the issue half competently, except for Lyndon LaRouche. And that's really what we need to do here. There's a reason we've said that 2022 is the year of Lyndon LaRouche. It's not only because this is the 100th year of his birth, but it's also because this is the time where his policies have got to be implemented. And people need to do some serious studying about them.
Harley?
Let me just add one thing to what Dennis just said, that one of the key issues here is the question of national sovereignty, because under the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, nations that still consider themselves sovereign would be signing away their sovereign rights to international institutions, those that haven't already done so. And the importance of sovereignty is that governments that are sovereign will act in the interests of their people as opposed to international institutions and especially international banking institutions, but will cooperate, as in the Peace of Westphalia, for the benefit of their neighbors and other nations. And that's crucial in addressing this issue. Now, on the question of Africa, look, there are, I think, 57 nations in Africa, so it's a very broad question. But I will point out that 27 African nations refused to give in to the pressure from the United States, the British, and the European Union to vote to condemn Russia in the UN General Assembly. So nearly half of the nations in Africa voted to abstain as opposed to condemn Russia. And in many of those countries, and I know a few of them from recent recent media appearances, that they're not just neutral on this question, but they're standing with Russia. But for certain reasons, they abstained rather than voting against. Now, the most important thing to do is realize that each of these countries have governments, have political parties, and if you're serious about getting involved in that, and I don't know if the questioner is from Africa or from the United States, but there are ways to get in touch with people in these countries through political parties, through institutions, and find out what the policy is. But many of these countries now are rejecting the Green New Deal. I believe it was the president of Senegal, and Senegal is now the head of the African Unity Organization. When the European Union went there and said to them, we want you to sign on to our Global Gateway program, which was the Green New Deal policy for Africa, which means no coal plants, no nuclear plants, only solar and so-called sustainable energy. The president of Senegal said, well, we didn't like what happened in Glasgow with the Green New Deal. So there are institutions in Africa which are committed to the development of the country. And that's just a question of doing some research and making some calls and finding out who's standing up for the rights of the people. So, I would say it's, it requires a certain amount of individual initiative, or if you want, you can send us your phone number and we can have someone who's more involved in the organizing in Africa give you a call.
Okay, we have.
Let me just add one point. If I could add just one point on that, a very good place to start is come to the conference this Saturday, because there are going to be, as a matter of fact, 3 or 4 from different African nations who will be participating in this international dialogue around a new Treaty of Westphalia. So that would be a very good place to start on solving the concern which you're raising.
So it's got the same question from 2 different people. One is from Kainan and the other is from a friend of mine from Brazil, who I'll leave it at that. And the question, as Kainan formulated, and I'll come back to the second formulation, you mentioned Russia, India, and China, the RIC, but what about South Africa and Brazil? What can they contribute as well? Is there a role the BRICS can play today in stabilizing the world and forming a new international security and development architecture? Now, my friend from Brazil was referring to the fact that Dilma Rousseff, the former president, had just given this speech in which there were 2 things. She said, we can't be content with Uber, iFood, and Airbnb. Those satisfied with being importers of technology will be subjected to an even more perverse form of what exists today. We will see young people who are neither employed nor studying. We cannot overcome the inequality of Latin America if we don't reindustrialize. And so she had heard about this. She's sort of a fan of Dilma and wanted to know, again, what are the prospects for the nations of Brazil and South Africa who have been part of this earlier process. I think she also wants to know what happened and what could be done. Are we capable of creating organizations in these countries that can make something happen?
Yeah, I read that speech of Dilma's, or I read a report on it. I didn't read the whole speech, and it is very good. It does talk about the need to industrialize all of South America, and she's absolutely right about that. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is an organization that comes out of the original creation of the RIC, Russia, India, China, which was established by Prime Minister Primakov of Russia as what he called the strategic triangle. It then first expanded to include Brazil, so it was the BRIC, and then South Africa was added and it became the BRICS. And in fact, many of the people involved in the discussions in terms of how to create a new global strategic architecture think that the BRICS have a very important role to play. And I do too. The reason to mention the RIC is simply that it's an immediate area where you have the ability to provide a relatively protected situation with three countries that are going to make a huge difference. And then, as we indicate in our program, that's why we call it RIC Plus, is you definitely need to expand this thing right away. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization is another very important forum for this kind of thing, which includes Russia, India, and China, and then a whole bunch of other countries, including the stands in that whole region. Another very important grouping is the Eurasian Economic Union, which is the Russian initiative for a block of nations that are cooperating economically. They are working with the Chinese Belt and Road. The entire Belt and Road is another structure as well. So I definitely agree. I agree with the idea of the BRICS. What happened, however, I mean, South Africa and Brazil are far more vulnerable to pressure and coups and so on than a country like Russia or China or even India. And they have been relatively quiet, especially Brazil. What happened in Brazil, as your friend Dennis obviously knows, is there was a coup d'etat in Brazil. There was an illegal, internationally sponsored coup d'etat which overthrew Dilma Rousseff, who was the sitting president of Brazil. They launched an operation run by the Department of Justice of the United States, and we have the names and the phone numbers, so to speak, of the people in the Department of Justice that ran a so-called corruption campaign, operating through their hand-picked judge in Brazil, whose name was Sergio Moro. His name still is Sergio Moro. And he was the one who orchestrated a kind of Italian-style mani pulite, a clean hands corruption, anti-corruption sweep. And Dilma was overthrown on spurious charges, and they then got former President Lula, who was very big along with Dilma in the whole BRICS formation, and they threw the guy in jail based on trumped-up charges coming out of the Department of Justice. Now, we've been victims of trumped-up charges coming out of the Department of Justice, throwing us in jail as well. We know a little bit about this and how it works. Lyndon LaRouche was in jail for 5 years for crimes he never committed. And it's well known internationally that that was the case. The only way you can fight these things are internationally by going after the people responsible. Now, I'm very encouraged by two things in Brazil. One is that even the terrible, liberal, destructive, unscientific, and illegally elected government of Bolsonaro in Brazil has realized that they can't survive without Russia. They get all their fertilizer from Russia. They at least have to maintain some modicum of a relationship. And so Bolsonaro traveled to Russia, to Moscow in the middle of this crisis, and that's very good. And I never thought I would praise Bolsonaro for anything, but I do praise him for that. However, the other thing that's encouraging is you've got elections coming up in Brazil. And I think there is more than a good chance that Lula will defeat Bolsonaro in the upcoming elections and allow Brazil to return to its rightful trajectory as a decisive factor strategically, internationally, and in particular through the BRICS.
Okay, this question is for Harley, and this is also from Jose. Is Germany intentionally trying to reduce the population of its country, or is it the unwitting fool of the British game of depopulation? I ask this because Germany once had nuclear plants that could have been used right now to offset the gas that they are not receiving. Also, what happened to their renewable energy? Why aren't we hearing about how their renewable plants are saving the day against the gas shortages? I would assume the media would be all over trying to promote the Green New Deal as a way to combat Putin, but that's not the mainstream narrative coming through, at least not what I've picked up. Okay, that's the question, Harley.
Well, pretty soon the only gas in Germany will be that coming from the political parties in the Bundestag, and especially the parties in the coalition, the Liberals, the Free Democratic Party, the Social Democrats and the Greens. I mean, the problem in Germany was, I think, correctly addressed by Zakharova, the spokesman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, when she said Germany is still acting as though it's a protectorate. You have to realize after World War II, the German leadership was subjected to a psychological brainwashing of collective guilt that people who had nothing to do with the Nazi Party were made to feel guilty by what Germany did during World War II. And that continued during the Cold War, that the Germans were among the staunchest of the Cold Warriors against the Soviet Union and against the East Germans. And there was a glimmer of hope, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche called the great potential or great promise of 1989, that the German people had reestablished through the mobilization to bring down the wall and to bring down the East German government, that Germany could move toward a sovereign status once again. But, I've lived here now for 6 years, and I find the fear of identifying with the German nation exists, including very strongly in the younger generation. The idea that to be a nationalist means you're a Nazi. That was what the brainwashing was about. And the Nazis were not about nationalism. They were about corporatism, corporate control, especially directed by the monopoly trusts of the synarchists of Wall Street and London. So the problem with Nazism has never been understood by the German people. And Helga Zepp-LaRouche wrote a book about this called The Hitler Book, where she explained how Germany was subjected to this operation, which was run largely through British geopolitics, to destroy Germany by putting it into 2 wars against Russia. And then after the Second World War, to convince the Germans that they could not have a military, could not have a national identity. And of course, Germany is a beautiful country, a country of poets, of great composers, of scientists. But to be proud of being German makes you suspect of being a Nazi. So it's under those circumstances that we've seen terrible governments. This current government, for a moment, looked as though it might move toward a course of the old Ostpolitik, of looking to the east, because Germany is integrated in many ways with Russia in terms of industry, industrial products, trade, also toward China. But the European Union is the dominant force in German politics. And you see that with the presence of Ursula von der Leyen as the president of the European Commission. So, we're being told that we may have gas rationing. To fill up your car now is, practically a week's salary. The price of food is going through the roof. And the German agriculture sector is being obliterated by the European Union policy. So at the same time, the question then becomes, what about science? What about technology? Will the German people reject the green brainwashing? And I'd say at this point, the only way that might happen is as the scarcity hits and as people realize that the whole global warming hoax has been perpetrated and pushed on them. You have this Potsdam Institute, which is the city where I live now. It's the center of European Union green policy. They're now saying that in order to have enough food, people are going to have to share the grain equally with the whole world, but consume less and have no grain or no food going to animals because we should no longer be eating animals. So will the Germans accept that? I mean, what happens when you have vegetable Wurst? I'm not sure it's going to work. There was once, I think it was Beethoven who said that there'll never be a revolution in Austria as long as there's beer and Wurst. Well, maybe these things will change. I don't know about beer, whether beer requires the wheat from the east, But I think the scarcity and what's coming in with this sanctions policy might cause a shift in Germany. Of course, that's what we're fighting for, and we're trying to bring people from the German institutions and the German population into the mobilization with the Schiller Institute.
It's certainly an occasion in which you do not want to bring up the slogan, "Eat people, not animals." I think you're going to have people who take you up on that. So, all right.
The United Kingdom.
I want to be there when in Munich when they begin selling the veggie wursts. Okay, I want to see what happens down there.
Veggie wurst, yeah. Artificial meat. That's right.
Okay, so Dennis, here's another question for you. This is from Arnold, and he's from Michigan. He asked this: can you explain how the creation of a new commodity called carbon credits or carbon taxes contributes to the overall inflation that we are seeing everywhere? I don't think that people understand how this Green New Deal works and contributes to inflation in this way.
Well, it works doubly by, on the one hand, excuse me, on the one hand, like all of these policies, they work doubly. On the one hand, you generate a new speculative bubble to allow speculation to occur. And the way this always works is the bubble is begun by the big financial interests. They then sucker the Mickeys into it, and then they depart, and they let the whole thing collapse on the Mickeys. I just heard over the weekend, for example, there's a big campaign to, believe it or not, reinflate the Spain real estate bubble, which was as bad or if not worse than the US and the British real estate bubbles. And it, of course, collapsed, but now they're reinflating it. And the people who are doing this are big international speculative hedge funds and others. They're traveling around the world to encourage people. They were just in Mexico, for example, to invest into the great new bubble, which is being created they don't call it a bubble, but the bubble that's being created in Spain. And this is just the classic story of suckering in the Mickeys and get them to put some money in there or steal their money from their bank accounts or steal it through carbon taxes, through government payments. That's another way of stealing, and so on. And then the whole thing has collapsed, and the only people who don't lose are the speculators. They come out on top. So on the one hand, that's part of the speculative bubble. It helps create it, and that creates inflation. That's the actual source of inflation. It's not shortages of this or that or excess demand and all of this nonsense that they teach you in economics about, demand pull inflation and all this stuff is just complete nonsense. It's because of the massive increase of financial instruments way beyond anything that the real physical economy can sustain. If you want to understand inflation, look at LaRouche's triple curve. The other side of this package is, as you can see in the triple curve, is you're channeling funds, channeling the trillions into inherently unproductive forms of energy. And this whole idea of, going back to the previous question of what's happening in Germany, can you possibly have the renewables replace what they're not getting from Russia? Well, of course not. They can't possibly do that. And since they don't want to reactivate nuclear, because that's their whole anti-nuclear drive, they're actually turning to old coal plants. The very people who argued against this thing are now saying, well, we got to go back to that. But through this carbon tax, what you are doing is you are actually encouraging a downshift of the overall power of the economy, especially in the energy sector, to be able to produce the advances that are needed. So the way the carbon tax thing works is, on the one hand, it creates a speculative bubble, and they tell people, well, you should really invest in this. We'll channel a bunch of government money into it. That's where we're going to, channel the trillions. And on the other hand, they destroy the physical economy, which is the only basis for maintaining any kind of financial instruments whatsoever. So that's how the thing works in that particular case, and it is the way it works overall. What you need to do in this, as in all cases, is the exact opposite. You need to encourage the most advanced forms of high energy flux density sources of power, such as nuclear energy moving rapidly to fusion power, and to have all credit that is generated channeled into those productive areas of activity, so that your rates of growth of increased productivity are greater than the increases in the credit. What you have now is the exact opposite. In other words, it couldn't possibly be worse than what they're doing. That's why there's inflation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so we have another, and I think this may be our final question, and it is this. It comes from Kynan. This is the second part of what he was asking, and I'll start out with you, Dennis, and Harley, you may have a comment. The Russian ruble is now almost back to its pre-war value, or pre-assault value, despite the sanctions intended to destroy the Russian economy. Does this mean that sanctions are losing their effectiveness in trying to destroy other nations? And could a country initiate an internal reconstruction program to make itself immune from sanctions by operating a national bank and issuing credit that way? So that's his question.
Well, again, start with the physical economy. I mean, it's always wise, and we always used to say this going back 40 years ago to the Malvinas War, when LaRouche was designing the idea of the Ibero-American common market. You have to start with the physical economy. You have to think, when you're running a country or you're running an economy, you have to think like a general in times of war, or like the marshal who's directing the entire deployment of troops to save your nation. What do you think about? You don't think about who's got money. You don't think about where's the gold. You don't think about prices. You don't think about any of that. You think about, where's the food that we need to live? Where's the energy? Do we have capital goods? Do we have housing? Do we have what the people need to survive? That's your starting point on this thing. And therefore, any and every country that is under assault should defend itself. They should put up exchange controls and capital controls. They should try to defend themselves from sanctions that way. But the immediate question that comes up is, how are they going to import the physical goods that they need to survive? And that's why when you look at a country like Russia, especially in combination with India and China, you begin to have the shape of something that is relatively defensible. I don't think the ruble is out of trouble, because it's good what they've done so far, but there's a few problems. One of the problems is that the head of the Central Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, is part of the same neoliberal crowd that was put in along with Chubais and Dvorkovich and others in the 1990s to run the Russian economy according to London's dictates. So she has raised interest rates in the country. You've got 20% interest rates in the country. You cannot run an economy with 20% interest rates. And it's good that they're defending it with exchange controls, but there's still a lot to be done. So the fact that the ruble has stabilized for the moment is good. The defensive measures are good. But you really have to think like, okay, I'm the general who's in charge of making sure that my entire population survives. How do we do it? Where do we go? Where do we get what we need to be able to do it? I think that's the point to be made. And since we're in the closing stretch here, let me just say one thing overall, which is, when people come to us and say, well, I don't agree with you guys, I support Ukraine, I support Ukraine. Our policy, what we are presenting, is a pro-Ukraine policy. We are supporting Ukraine. We are supporting Ukraine in the only way you can, not by putting little ribbons in front of your house or stopping purchasing vodka just because it has a Russian name when it isn't even made in Russia in the first place, or stupid things of that sort, or saying, oh, it's so terrible what's happening. Yeah, it is terrible. The only way to save Ukraine and support Ukraine, listen, Ukraine was a prosperous, developing country with heavy industry, advanced machine tools, a thriving industrial sector. It's the Black Earth area of Europe. They have incredible agricultural potential. And that's all been destroyed by 30 years of neoliberal policies as part of this 50-year takedown. If you want to help Ukraine, and we should tell people this, I'm sick and tired of being told, oh, I'm with Ukraine and you're supporting Russia. Nonsense. We're supporting the human race, including Ukraine. And what you're doing by backing the British policy and the Washington policy is you're destroying the human race. If you want to support Ukraine, how are we going to get 10 million more people employed in that country in productive jobs? They've lost a third of their labor force, 25% in manufacturing at least. You have to rebuild all of that. And the only way to do that, the only way to salvage Ukraine is by a treaty which will establish its neutrality so that the NATO nonsense stops and we establish a world system that will allow them and other countries to develop as is their actual right. And I think that Harley's point on sovereignty is absolutely well taken. We have to have sovereign nations with sovereign currencies that work together for the benefit of all of mankind.
So, Harley, I don't know if you have anything to say on that question. If not, I
actually have something to say on it. But I want to say that what Dennis just said about Ukraine, people should study that, should read it and think about it, because this is the brainwashing that you have to take a side and that the Ukrainian people are victims. They're not victims of Russia. They're victims of NATO and victims of this Anglo-American policy. Now that gets to the question on sanctions. Can Russia win this fight on sanctions? Look, sanctions are a form of war crime. There are sanctions being conducted against the people of Afghanistan that threaten millions of lives as we're meeting today. Sanctions are killing children in Syria, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Iraq, and other countries around the world. And the sanctions against Russia are designed to create the pain in Russia that would create the basis for a movement to have a regime change there. So sanctions policy is a form of war. So the question is not, can you beat the sanctions or overcome the sanctions? You have to stop the governments that are using this. In the same way, you have to stop governments from supporting these regime change wars. And that's the question that people have to look to. And that's what we're doing with the conference, is speaking to the conscience of the world's population. If you don't want to see this kind of death and destruction, we have a program that will work. Now, I just wanted to say one other point on this. I've been getting emails where people say, well, it sounds like you're just trying to set up another international organization. Well, yes, international organizations aren't the problem. It's the people who run them. Government is not the problem. It's the people who control them. Our job is to create governments which are responsive to the needs of their population. That's what a sovereign nation is. That's what our Constitution was about. If we stand for the constitutional principle for the United States, we should wish that every other country has that same principle, that the people are sovereign, and that the nation state then can function as a sovereign entity on behalf of the general welfare of its population. And so that's what we're fighting for. We're not fighting for some kind of new world order controlled by Davos. You know, some people even go so far as to say, well, isn't Russia and China, aren't they the chosen choice, the choice of the Davos crowd to run the new world order? Well, you obviously aren't paying attention if you believe that, because all you have to do is read the lies and slanders against Putin, against Xi Jinping, the lies about Xinjiang province and so on, to realize that they are trying to destroy these countries, not put them in control of a world order. So I think there's a lot of confusion out there, which if people study this report that we put out and come to our conference, it'll go a long way toward unconfusing people.
Yeah, so we basically, that's the last of our questions. I'm going to ask that both of you would address something as we go to the close. And we do have a video of Lynn for the absolute close, which is the following: the issue of unipolarity versus multipolarity, which in one sense is something you were beginning to touch on right there, Harley, as you were responding to what's being talked about there. Since, in fact, what we're talking about and what the economics of Lyndon LaRouche was all about had nothing to do with either one of those things. and the idea that there's some sort of either, quote, mosaic of nations that you have to have, or you have some dominant Leviathan that claims to be running things for the better good of the human race. So since we've talked about this as being the year of LaRouche, and in addition, we're having the conference next week and have been talking about our LaRouche legacy process as well. Dennis, I'm going to ask that you go first and just say something about that whole matter, since in fact you've dealt with so many different nations, in particularly South America, Central America, for so many decades. And this question of the United States' role vis-a-vis those nations and how those nations should be working together with the United States has always been an electric, almost a third rail. And having a discussion with people of a serious variety, of a serious type about what needs to be done is something you've had to live through. Not to mention your spending time incarcerated together with Lyndon LaRouche precisely because of the successes of what we did in South America, Central America, and more generally. So if you would go first, and then Harley, you second, and we'll conclude for today.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of that your choices are unipolarity or multipolarity, it's again the old story. When given two alternatives, choose the third. The very idea of polarity is mistaken. What's the assumption behind it? It's like if you've got an orchestra, you tell everybody, well, either you can all play the exact same note, and you have Leviathan, the conductor, who says that note, and you all play that note. That's unipolarity. Or multipolarity is an argument of, well, anyone can, just go ahead and play your own note, whatever you feel like playing. That's sort of the mosaic of nations idea, which is the idea that somehow or other, well, everyone has the right to play any damn note they feel like playing. That is not going to produce a piece of music, guaranteed. And the concert of nations is very similar to that. It starts from an entirely different concept of man. The idea of unipolarity and of multipolarity each start from the same standpoint of polarity. That is to say, that each nation, each group, each individual have their own distinct interests, which are self-defined. The concept of man is that man is an individual whose own interests and purpose is defined ultimately in terms of his own pleasure and pain. The whole idea of hedonism, the whole Bentham philosophic calculus. And that the best you can do under those circumstances is when you have everyone who is responding according to their own self-defined, personal, individualistic interest, defined so, is you either have the choice of a war of each against all, like Hobbes said, where everyone goes their own way. And then, of course, you require a Leviathan to come in and impose some sort of dictatorship on people. So there's either that kind of unipolar dictatorship, which is unipolarity, or the other kind of approach, which seems to be more popular oriented, but it's the idea of the social contract, which is that everyone negotiates based on their defined self-interest, defined in exactly that way. And they're both wrong. They're completely wrong, because man is not defined as that. That's not what an individual's self-interest is, and that's not what human beings are. What distinguishes us as a species, as Lyndon LaRouche never tired of saying and explaining over and over and over again, is that man is uniquely the species that is defined as capable of creative insight and discovery of the physical principles of the universe, and of relating to other people, other nations, other individuals, on the basis of that kind of joint common interest. Therefore, the fundamental science is creativity, and the fundamental emotion or state of psychology is love of mankind, of charity, of agape. It's the idea that my personal interest is the benefit of the other. It's not that I tolerate other people so long as they don't infringe on my benefit. That wasn't the idea of the Treaty of Westphalia. It's based on a totally different concept of man, which is what we actually are. And it shouldn't be so difficult to understand if people think of this. I mean, you don't see it around you a lot, but if you just think of a family, how do parents define their own self-interest? Well, I'm going to, I'll let my kid do something so long as it doesn't infringe on my time. Well, some people act that way, but that's not really it. The overriding sense of a parent is whatever is necessary for the development of the child. That's the state of mankind. That is the proper, most natural state of mankind. So both unipolarity and multipolarity are wrong because it's based on the wrong idea of man. And the reason that Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been insisting on returning to the Treaty of Westphalia is not because that's a nice piece of parchment or an interesting document. It's because they changed the very concept of man on which society was organized. And nothing less than that is going to work today. And that's the central point. And therefore, I would say, as I said at the outset, that if it's broke, you ought to fix it. And that's what's broke. And that's what we ought to fix.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis. Harley?
Well, as a parent of 3 children, I was thinking what Dennis was saying. At times, I feel as though I'm in a multipolar world, and it doesn't work. But the whole essence of the multipolar argument is the same as identity politics, that since you can't achieve agreement on the basis of higher principles or of natural law, you have to accept something less than that. And that to think you can do something better is idealism, utopianism, unrealistic, not practical, and on and on and on. And, I think the point is that the opposition to a unipolar world, the opponents of a unipolar world, have been led to believe that you can't achieve something as based on the principles of the Peace of Westphalia, and therefore you have to accept something less than that. And multipolarism, at least you allow people to do things that they like and that they want to do, and you accept it. Now, if we did that, the human race still wouldn't thrive. It still wouldn't continue to exist because the choices that are there, for example, on the Green New Deal and economic policy, unless you have an effort of many nations now in space exploration, as we go back to what Lynn was talking about earlier, the world as a whole is threatened by things that we don't see. Asteroids, planets breaking apart, things hurtling at the Earth. We need cooperation on these higher levels. And you don't get that in a world that's multipolar. But I think the idea of multipolar is an acceptable belief among people who think that unipolar is bad, but we can never achieve a world based on principle. If we don't fight for that, we're not truly human. If we don't fight for the higher principle based on the belief in the creative potential of every human being, then we're going to fall short of anything that is acceptable for the future. And so I think that's why Helga has made this effort with this conference to make people familiar with the extraordinary fight that took 3 years. The Peace of Westphalia was a 3-year negotiation in 2 cities. And when it finally worked, they were surprised that it did achieve a peace, including between the Protestant rebellion and the Catholic Church. Now, was it perfect? No. But it was based on the right principle, the benefit of the other, which after all is the basis of the ecumenical, the Abrahamic religions, that you live to carry out that which is good for others. So I think that either we fight for that or we've given up on humanity.
Dennis Mall, Harley, Schlanger, thank you very much for being with us today. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Again, we have a conference that the Schiller Institute is having a conference, which is going to start at 9 o'clock on next Saturday, called To Establish a New Security and Development Architecture for All Nations. So 3 panels, it's all day and starts at 9. And we would urge that you both join us. And here we see the panels, I guess they're showing me. okay, which is why the failure of the old paradigm requires the design of a new paradigm in international relations, a new security architecture in the tradition and Peace of Westphalia, and the Bandung Conference, which I will reference in a moment. Then session 2, for a new just world economic order, preventing the starvation of 1 billion people. That's our second session. And the third session on development, finally overcoming colonialism and imperialism. Development is the new name for peace, the need to build a world health system. So that's going to be our conference. And as you can see from the conference, and you can, if you're in touch with us over the next days, you'll be told all about the speakers and the character of the conference. But get in touch with people and get in touch with us here to pre-register for the conference. Now, as we go to our conclusion, we just want to point something out, because tomorrow in Pakistan, Prime Minister Imran Khan is going to face a vote of no confidence, which has essentially been instigated from outside of his country. He made it clear in the course of the past days and has produced documents to this effect that the United States is the nation that is attempting to do regime change, suggesting behind the scenes in the fashion of what John Perkins called economic hitmen, that you get visits that essentially persuade you that it might be in your best interests to change your government voluntarily. And this, the idea that he has, that is Prime Minister Imran Khan has put forward, is that they may be attempting to give me the Bhutto treatment. This refers to Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who in 1976 received a visit from then Secretary Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger basically let him know that if Pakistan did not give up their full set nuclear power program, that, quote, we will make a horrible example of you. Now, people later on tried to say that they didn't know whether that was exactly said, but that's what Bhutto said was said to him. And I referenced this because it says something about the issue of immortality, which I want to take up as we conclude. Bhutto wrote from jail about this. He said, Dr. Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State for the United States, told me that I should not insult the intelligence of the United States by saying that Pakistan needed the reprocessing plant for her energy needs. In reply, I told him that I will not insult the intelligence of the United States by discussing the energy needs of Pakistan. But by the same token, he should not insult the sovereignty and self-respect of Pakistan by discussing the plant at all. And what this was about was that Bhutto was one of the people who was a founder of Pakistan's Atomic Energy Commission. As he put it, when he first began to work on this in the 1950s, it was only a name on the wall, on a door. And that he was able to work through great diligence and the engineering prowess of that nation to create a full set nuclear industry. Nuclear power is at the core of the transformation of the planet, providing more and more energy at a greater density and greater efficiency for more and more people. Matter of fact, had nuclear power been allowed to be developed over the past several decades, then there would not have even been the excuse for what is being done under the pretext of the so-called Green New Deal and climate change. That is, that's not real. And the climate change business is all a fake. However, it's also the case that if it were real, the problem that it says to be addressing or wishes to address would be addressed through nuclear technology. Bhutto was in fact executed. He certainly thought that the United States was the cause of his problems, his trials, and yet he was prepared to go through, as he did, with his assertion that he would not bend, he would not yield. And in fact, he wasn't defeated, merely executed. The nuclear power program of Pakistan, in fact, did prevail. Now, we're saying this because with all the talk that we're saying here about the need for new architecture and the need for new policies and the different ways in which different heads of state and others can lobby and organize for these, it should also be said that people who have been courageous have also had to risk their own mortality in one sense, but it really wasn't a risk, because the issue was that if you identify yourself as a human being in terms of the contribution that your brief time on this planet allows you to make to the future as a whole and the reorganization of the past, then you really can't lose. Lyndon LaRouche addressed this matter in 1995 in a conference of the Schiller Institute, in which he was talking about what he called at the time heavy ideas. And he took up this particular question. We want to leave you with this today, and you'll get and be able to hear more of this sort of thing next week at our conference when you join us there. So thank you for listening today.
That in the numerousness of population and the expanse of time, our mortal existence is very brief, very small. And this comes to a point of personal wisdom. If your life is so brief, if the span of it is so small, then how should you deal with this opportunity called a mortal existence? Should you decide that you're going to have a good family and personal life in this tiny infinitesimal niche, which is here today and gone tomorrow and easily forgotten? Is that your interest? Pleasure, satisfaction, security, avoiding trouble? Is that your pleasure? Is that your life? Then let the dead bury the dead, as the gospel says. But don't you have another purpose? Just think of these young boys in the Augustinian teaching orders, the orphans, the poor boys from poor families, in the Franciscan orders or in the Brotherhood of the Common Life. What are they doing? These boys are working over manuscripts. They're copying the manuscripts and they're studying, reliving the mind, the mental experience of Plato and others in these discoveries. The boys are reliving the thoughts, the mental acts of discovery of the greatest geniuses in all known human existence. These boys, living in poverty, working in some religious order's school in the 14th and 15th century, know Plato better than they know the next door neighbor. Because they know the inside of the mind, because they have relived a moment from the inside of the mind of Plato or Archimedes and so forth. Thus, these boys have a direct relationship across thousands of years. They also know things from unknown generations. Think language. We know that the first good astronomy, a solar astronomical calendar that we've known to us today, was developed between the 6th and 4th millennia BC in Central Asia. Now, these people made wonderful discoveries. Why do we know about that? Because the people used poetry, a very advanced type of strophic poetry. There was no written language at that time. These things came down to us because of a very ingenious development called poetry. The poetry was possible because the language had been developed. We know from the work, some work on Sanskrit in the 5th century BC, the principles of how this language is developed. So even when we are learning a language, we are learning something, a tool which is given to us, which comes down from many thousands of years before us. A person who is educated in these things has a mind which is in touch with humanity way back, which is affecting the outcome of the work of what people did thousands of years ago. Somebody made a discovery thousands of years ago, and you today help to realize the benefit of that discovery, which has never been realized before. You are changing the past by changing the outcome of the past. You absorb an idea. You may not even make a discovery, but you pass these ideas along as a teacher or a parent to children and others. You transmit these ideas to future generations. Suddenly your reach, your existence is enormous. You live with the past. You live with the future. And if someone says, why are you born, why you live? Well, I don't know exactly why, but I know I discovered a mission and I have performed it. I have used this brief speck of existence, and I've used it well. I've used it to change things for the better, through good ideas, through questioning, either through generating good ideas or simply even by retransmitting them as a teacher to those who need use of it, to coming generations. So the problem we have is typified by the student, or you think you may be acquainted with the student. Some teacher is trying to help some students, and the teacher brings up a subject which he thinks the students should be interested in at that point in their education. And some wise guy in the class gets up and says, "Hey, teacher, are we going to be held accountable for this on the next examination?" Now, Schiller had a polite word for this called the Brotgelehrten. These people have no respect for knowledge whatsoever. They have no respect for their own minds. They only have respect for what am I going to get out of it in terms of career and money if I get this degree. You have people slithering along the streets today with college degrees who couldn't get out of a decent high school 25 years ago or 50 years ago. Of that principle. So do you have respect for yourself as human? Do you have respect for your own mind? Do you believe in ideas? Do you believe that some ideas are beautiful? Do you believe that ideas have beauty and others not, of course? Do you believe in the transmission of beauty to other people, of sharing beauty as ideas with other people? If so, you can be as poor, as miserable, as isolated, as mistreated as you may want to be. But if you're that kind of a person, you're a good person. You're important to humanity. You don't have to justify your existence. But if you snuck into the caboose of life seeking pleasure, I'm going to get all I can. I got to look after my interests. I got to take care of my personal interests. I can't be bothered with the world. I can't be bothered with subjects which I don't get paid for by an A on an examination paper, which I don't get better pay for. Then you've got the moral problem we face today.